Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I recently saw a tweet that reminded me that there is an entire philosophy that's, I don't know if it's growing or it's established, or I'm not really sure how to define it. But it is a very different way of looking at type than I have traditionally looked at type. And it comes up with the subject of what's called loops. Now, loops are when in cognitive functions, each person, of course, based on your personality type, you will have 4 cognitive functions that are most influential to you. And the first function is called your dominant. We call it your driver. The second is your auxiliary. We call it your co-pilot. The third is your tertiary. We call it your 10-year-old. And the fourth is your inferior, and we call that the 3-year-old. And when the driver and the 10-year-old, or the dominant and tertiary functions, get in a relationship with each other where they're primarily pinging off of each other and they don't check in with the second, that auxiliary or co-pilot function, we call that being in a loop. Well, I recently saw a tweet where a person said, well, that's stupid. It's totally normal for people to just ping off their first and third functions, right? That's like a completely normal and average thing to do. And so to call it a loop is, they were almost like acting like that's baffling. Why would you do that? And then one of our profiler training students said that they ran into another type enthusiast in the wild, quote unquote.
Meaning outside of our profiler training program.
Right. And when they were in this conversation around type, the other individual gave our profiler training student pushback on this idea of a loop, saying, no, that's just a subtype. That's just a way that the type can show up. So I do think that there is a growing idea that certain personality types or certain variations with personality types just have a preference for their third function over their second function. And that's a very valid way of experiencing your type and a very valid way of showing up to the world. And not that I want to invalidate anybody's experience or the choices that they make. I mean, these are your cognitive functions. You can do whatever you want with them, basically. But there is a strong argument to be made that that's not merely a subtype. That dynamic and relationship isn't just something that is, it might be normal, but it's not optimal. And I think we should talk a little bit about the philosophy we have and why we think and have been basically saying for the last 10 plus years that we've had this business, that getting into your auxiliary function or getting into the co-pilot is an incredibly leveraged thing for each person to do.
And I would just make sure I make a point here that this isn't just theory from our standpoint. We've been coaching for the last 10 years using personality type, and we've seen with clients and people that we've coached over and over again, encouraging them to optimize and move into growing their co-pilot or auxiliary function. And we've seen result after result after result with actual people in actual coaching sessions. This isn't just made up by us. This isn't just theory. This is from practical real-world experience.
Well, it's why we believe it, right? Because there's very few things in type theory that I quote-unquote believe, right? I hold a lot of it pretty loosely. But I would say if I was going to, have any sort of strong position when it comes to personality type, it's the absolute imperative need to have a good relationship with your auxiliary function, and in a way where you're not defining yourself or creating an entire subtype around not being in it. I think it's actually maybe even dangerous for a person to self-identify as somebody who is avoidant of it. Now, a person might say, well, I'm not avoiding it. I just prefer my 10-year-old or tertiary. I would actually argue everybody does. I don't think that that's a specific subtype. I think everybody really likes that 10-year-old or tertiary function. And so I don't know if it's particular to certain people, but I would say that there are certain people whose lives have allowed them to have that dynamic more and maybe didn't push them into that second function, the auxiliary or co-pilot. And since they didn't get encouragement to do so, it almost becomes a version of type entropy. It's like the thing that we're all almost pre-set up to do, and we have to resist it a bit. We have to make conscious decisions to get into that part of who we are, or maybe we were lucky enough to be raised in an environment that encouraged it. But it's something that we will almost default to unless we resist the desire. So I don't know if I would say it's a subtype. I would almost say it's preconditions for us to go back and forth between those first and third functions. And again, even though we're pre-wired to do it, it's kind of like we're pre-wired also to sit around on the couch and do nothing and eat potato chips all day. Like we're sort of pre-wired to do that. But after a very small amount of time, you'll go, I don't think this is good for me. Maybe I shouldn't just be doing this.
So let's lay down some premises here, or some understanding about the human condition and type itself. As humans, we all need four things. We need a way to gather information, to perceive our world and see what, is happening. And then we need a way to make judgments or evaluations on that information we perceive. So we need to be able to make a decision based on what we perceive. Number 3, we need to be able to get into our inner space, our inner world, and understand what's going on for us inside of our hearts and minds. And then we have to have a way to interface with the outer world, interface with other people and the structural elements and maybe the objective things outside of ourselves, we could say. And so all 4 of those things that humans need, the first 2 cognitive functions in our personality handle for us. It's a way for us to perceive our world, a way for us to make judgments on what we perceive, a way to get in touch with our inner space, and a way to get in touch with the outer world as well.
Right. Yeah. You're going to get all 4 of those components with those 2 functions. The challenge when you get into that third function and skip the second one is that you're still getting the need to take in new information and to make decisions or judge that information met. So it feels like a complete experience, but you are staying in what's called the attitude of the dominant first or driver function. So if your dominant or driver function is extroverted, your 10-year-old tertiary third function is also extroverted. If your dominant first driver function is introverted, then your 10-year-old tertiary third function is also introverted. So you're getting 3 of the 4 things you just mentioned, Joel. You're getting information and judgment, or perceiving and judgment, but you're not getting either introversion or extroversion. Now, it's easy to see why a person needs both perceiving and judgment, or taking in new information and evaluating it. If we are only ever taking in new information and never making a decision, well, I mean, you can see the results of people's lives who avoid decision-making at all cost. The decisions of their lives are made by not making decisions. They hand themselves over to the world. Everybody else has to make their decisions for them and move them along. They accomplish nothing. On the other side, people who only ever make decisions and never take in new information, you can see the results of their lives. It's just as bad, but almost the photo negative of it. It's like they're making tons of decisions, but they're always the wrong decision because they're ill-informed. And they jump to conclusions and they judge neutral things. And there's all sorts of problems there. So the tension point of consuming information, taking it in, ruminating upon it, understanding the importance of being a well-informed person, the tension point between that and making good evaluations, making good decisions, right? Making more effective or more, authentic or more harmonious or more accurate, however you want to say it, but making higher quality decisions. And there's that tension point between the two. And I think we all instinctively know that we need to get that tension point right. For those of us who lead with information gathering or perceiving, we really do understand that the quality of our decisions needs to go up because we have a bias towards information consumption.
That's all EPs and IJs in the Myers-Briggs system.
Right. Well, we won't take the right actions as quickly because we think that it's almost like we're constantly in preparation. Even if we are acting, we're not necessarily making life choices. And on the other side, people who have a bias towards decision making, the lesson of their life is to make sure that they slow down enough to take in the right information, to inform those decisions and not make the same mistakes over and over.
Those are EJs and IPs in the Myers-Briggs system.
Exactly. And so whatever we have a bias towards, we can feel it. We can feel it in the choices we make or in the lack of choices, right? We can feel it in the quality of our lives. And we almost always get this sense of like, I think I need to be doing this other thing a little bit more. But for some reason, I don't think we see the balance between introversion and extroversion in quite the same critical way or crucial way. I think when a person is an introvert, they're almost always fighting for the right to be an introvert. They assume that the world is pulling them into extroversion, and they're not wrong. It does do that. We've talked about that in the podcast before. But there's this sense of, well, I should be able to introvert as much as I want to. And I think extroverts don't always get as much feedback or as much, counsel or advice to be introspective and introverted. And so for an extrovert, it might just be a matter of ignorance or just not knowing the importance of it. But the balance, the tension point between introversion and extroversion, I think, is as critical as the tension point between information gathering and decision making. Like, we have a bias towards one or the other, and that should be acknowledged and accounted for. We should also make sure that we're getting the needs met of our dominant driver or first function, meaning that there are certain things that we're going to need in order to feel the most like ourselves. And that will maybe mean more alone time if you're an introvert, or maybe more going out and doing things as an extrovert, right? There might be some needs in order to feel complete and in flow. But feeling complete and in flow is not the same as doing personal growth work. It's not the same as observing ourselves and looking at the blind spots we carry, looking at the challenges that we experience and figuring out what we can do as individuals to avoid those challenges or navigate through them or optimize the experience or learn the right lessons. That's all totally different than tailoring our lives to make sure that, we feel nourished and refreshed. And while I'm a big fan of learning your personality type, understanding your functions so you can create an ergonomic environment that suits how you operate and honors how you're pre-wired, gives you an ability to have, sovereignty and agency and permission to be wired the way that you are. I would also say an ergonomic lifestyle, like a truly healthy one, folds in the need to develop those other sides, to set up a context that pushes you and challenges you to get into the elements of yourself that are not as natural, but are crucial. So if you lead with information gathering, perceiving, just like you said, Joel, those are EPs and IJs, then an ergonomic lifestyle sets you up to be able to flex that second function of judging. An ergonomic lifestyle, if you lead with a judging function like the EJs and IPs do, an ergonomic lifestyle sets you up so that you can stretch into the information gathering aspect, the perceiving aspect. So I personally think ergonomics isn't just about feeling good. It's about doing things that keep you aligned, keep you healthy. Like a good ergonomic office chair isn't one that's just cushy, right? It's not a lazy boy. It's one that has you sitting up in a way that will create the most sustainable flow of energy so you can work the longest without harming yourself. And that's what growth does. When we set up an ergonomic lifestyle for ourselves, we don't set it up so that it's cushy, so that it just feels good. We set it up so that it gets the most out of our capacities, or out of our potentiality. It is something that allows us to be energized and puts us in a place of alignment for the longest so that we're not fatigued by unnecessary energy expenditures.
You're being so diplomatic and nice, Antonia, in all this. You're like, this is the best way to go about it. You're being gentle. You're articulate. This is my personal opinion. If you want to just bypass and skip or jump past the co-pilot or auxiliary function and what it brings to your life. By the way, I have a personal story about this too. I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to bypass the hard work, or at least the attention work that it took to grow that part of my personality. Of course it was easier to go just straight to my tertiary or 10-year-old. Of course I liked that. I could lean on it. I had some experience with it. It got me the results I wanted. Like, it felt better. It wasn't as hard. Like, there was so much that I could, quote unquote, on paper justify or reason out to say this is actually more superior than growing my co-pilot or auxiliary. In fact, the story is, I remember back in the early days of me working on this, I was upset, angry, in tears at times, because it's hard work often to really stay present to growing this aspect of your personality. And I wanted to demonize it. I wanted to push it away. I wanted to give every excuse why it was so much a better thing to just go past that to the 10-year-old or tertiary and just stay in my extroverted space, moving fast, getting things done. That's unique to my personality, but everybody's got a version of this. And I just see it as another distraction, another easy way out, another just resting into what you've done before, not stretching or growing yourself, and then finding some explanation of why that's okay. That's the real message that I'd give. And I think the diplomatic thing is nice too, but man, it's just, there's so much bang for your buck when you grow this co-pilot auxiliary function. There's just so much value that comes to your life.
Oh, I don't think I'm being diplomatic. I think I'm trying to make a case.
All right.
Well, I'm trying to argue for why, in a way that isn't just an anecdote, my personal anecdote. I want to make a case for why I think it really is the healthiest option to go to that auxiliary. And why I think that when we set ourselves up for success, we're not going to create a world that just suits our pre-desires. Like you mentioned, Joel, I mean, I would say that you as an ENFP, man, there is so much reward for an EFP type to go to their 10-year-old or tertiary of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. The outside world will reward the hell out of that, right? It'll tell you all sorts of things like, yes, go make a business, go make money, go build resource, go get things done, go make things happen, be as effective and efficient as possible and build those systems. And you do get the resource benefit from it. You do get a lot of reward from the outside world. When is the world ever going to say, okay, now, I know that you're rocking and rolling on this business that you've created and you're doing a pretty good job, but now I want you to stop all production and get into your feelings and how you feel about things and what your intentions and motivations are, and try to figure out what your subjective human experience is to get in touch with your identity and what's in alignment. And then make sure that when you go into your business situation, you're never going to do anything that offends that part of who you are, even though that will clearly do a lot more for you financially than to listen to your conscience and allow your passions to guide the way. Right? Like nobody's going to say that. Why would they? Why would they say that to you? They're going to reward the thing that they can directly experience and will benefit themselves.
Well, and the few voices that would say that to me, I'm going to certainly dismiss them and want to listen to the voices that confirm my bias already.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, yeah, okay, that whole getting inside yourself thing, I'll handle that later in life, maybe, right? Well, I'm young. I've got all this energy and vitality. Shouldn't I be pouring it into shoring up my financial reserves for the future? Would be a very reasonable thing to think, right? And so I think for you and all EFPs, this ask that they go to their second or auxiliary function is a pretty big ask, right? And I could see why a lot of them would be like, nope, that's not me. I'm the other kind. I'm this subtype. I'm this very individualized version of an EFP that wants to get as far the hell away from my introverted feeling as possible. And it's like, I think if you're raised in a context at all that doesn't nurture that part, it's very easy to push it away and shove it away. I think for myself, I have a correlated story of getting into my second or auxiliary function after basically being told if I did that, I was going to lose everybody. And so for me, being in a quote unquote loop was a survival tactic. I could have very easily justified it as a subtype. I could have very easily told myself, well, that's just the version of ENTP that I am. Because my extroverted feeling or harmony 10-year-old or tertiary, like listening to that more and obeying what it wanted and the rewards it was getting more than my second or co-pilot function of introverted thinking or accuracy, that wasn't just a preference. It wasn't just something getting rewarded. It was a survival technique. Because once I got into my auxiliary, that co-pilot of introverted thinking or accuracy, all of a sudden I couldn't believe the things that I was being told I had been indoctrinated to believe my entire life. Now I was thinking my own thoughts and following what made sense to me. And the cost was literally everything, right? And that's what happens when you're raised in a cult. When you're raised in a cult, when you leave the cult isn't super happy about that and they make sure they punish you. And so that was the situation I found myself in. And so I could very easily have spent the rest of my life going like, no, that's just my style. Avoid of the real thoughts, the real things that made sense to me. Don't introspect, don't get inside, don't figure out what you're thinking. I could have very easily made that choice and justified it by saying it was a subtype. But the truth was it wasn't a preference that was healthy. It wasn't something that was allowing me to live my, the life that I was intended to live or bring the most out of me. And while on a philosophical level, I am open to being wrong, On a philosophical level, I am open to information hitting me and striking me in a way that I had not considered it would. So I'm making that caveat or that bookend before I say what I'm about to say to indicate that I don't believe I have all the answers. I would say that time after time after time, when we're doing coaching, when we're talking to other people, it is an avoidance of that co-pilot or auxiliary function that is messing them up more than anything else. Now, not 100% of people, not everybody. There are some people who say have a bad relationship with their dominant or driver. Obviously, that's the first work they need to do, right? If you've got a bad relationship with that function, if you are not allowed to be in it, that's what we call a grip, and it's a very sad situation. Usually they're gripped by their 3-year-old or inferior function, and that's a totally different phenomena for a different podcast. But for those people, doing work in their dominant or driver is obviously the first domino. For other people, they have done work in that co-pilot or auxiliary already. And in fact, they've done so much work that they've learned to balance it and beautifully navigate it between that function and the 3rd or tertiary or 10-year-old function. And that's already down. And now their work is integrating the inferior or 3-year-old function. That also happens too. These are very lucky people, unlike the people who were sort of coached and trained and maybe even forced to get out of their dominant or driver and are now in a perpetual grip, which is the saddest situation a person can be in. The most enviable position a person can be in is that they've already done work on their first 3 functions and their life that just set them up to do that. I've known a couple people who don't know anything about type, but I get their story. I profile them, I get their story and realize from the time they were tiny, their entire world has been, designed to keep them in the healthiest version of those 3 functions. And those people are like, they're the most grounded, settled, developed, beautiful human beings I run into. So you can be on 2 sides of the bell curve, right? The unfortunate and the highly fortunate. But most of us fall somewhere in between. And for the overwhelming majority of people, that second function is the leverage point.
I'm sure if you look at your own life and you have also developed your co-pilot or auxiliary function, you probably have a similar story of maybe avoiding it, the hard work it took to get in there, and maybe even the push-pull relationship while you were working on it. And then at some point you crossed a threshold where like, wow, I'm getting a lot of great results in my life from this aspect of who I am. This is incredible. Like, I didn't even know this part of me was this awesome. And now I'm not pushing it away. I don't have a love-hate relationship. I actually love this part of myself. I want to integrate it more. I think at this point, what we can do now is pivot maybe over into some more Jungian concepts and more Jungian thought. The Myers-Briggs system is built upon Carl Jung's work. I think in the modern type circles, YouTube channels and things like this, I think there's like a lot of drift away from the core of where this all came from, right? And it's like, well, there's like some original thought around this. There's some original core principles that we can look at that can help us stay on track on what are we actually talking about here? What are we doing? I mean, there's a sense that in our postmodern world, you can just make stuff up and it can just be real because you say it is, or you just like posit it. But this is all based on a lot of study, work, research, and original principles that I think we can visit a little bit as we think about these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I make a whole living out of just saying stuff and hoping people will buy it, but so I don't want to demonize that part too much.
I don't think it comes out of the thin air, but
it does not. I do like to think that I like to think my stuff is well researched, and I've got a lot of really good patterns that live underneath.
I guess this is what I'm trying to say is when you really have security in your ideas and yourself, you are not complex. You bring things down to very simple, basic access point. And I think if you and I are doing our jobs well, Antonia, someday, years from now, people will say, "Thank you for making this accessible and approachable and simple for me."
I think that there is a case to be made for complexity.
Of course, you're introverted thinking. Of course, you're going to say this.
I'll just say that. Okay. All right. So I've got like 3 things tagged in my brain based on what you just said. The first one is that there is a case to be made for complexity, but I think at the end of the day, what you're looking for is, as you mentioned before, core principles. And when you find core principles themselves are not complex. They are like the irreducible element of whatever it is that you're studying, right? They're the pylon that everything else gets built on top of. And once you're able to find those core principles, I think that those are and should be accessible to all, right? A core principle is something that doesn't change depending upon context. It's something that is it's the 1 and 0, right? You can't split it any more than it has been split. So finding those core principles, in my opinion, is one of the rewards of going through all the all the complexities of things and how you can see things through a million different lenses. There is a benefit to seeing things through a million different lenses and looking and slicing and dicing and figuring out a bunch of elements and flaying things out and seeing all of the richness and all of the patterns. I do think that there is a case to be made for that. And it can become its own reward, which is fine as long as you don't actually want to accomplish anything. If you fillet things out in perpetuity forever, then there's no action plan. There's no moment when you go, okay, and this is how I apply it, or this is now how I'm going to fold it into my life in a way that is sustainable. So I do think that there is a law of diminishing returns on complexity.
I heard somebody say recently, just because you understand a problem doesn't mean you've solved the problem.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that's something that people conflate all the time, is being able to understand is the same as having solved it. It is an understandable desire to continue to flay out a complex and powerful system. It is its own reward in some way.
Well, that's different than continuing to add to the system. That's what I'm talking about. I understand taking a system that is and finding more and more access points, more and more application. I'm talking about adding more to it, like layers and layers and layers of complexity on top of this that don't even mean the same things. And I see not just in Myers-Briggs, all over the world. I think people do that. This is a natural proclivity because I think it's a place that we, as humans, when we feel insecure and we don't want to apply a system to ourselves, we take a bypass and we create extra and excess complications to distract and to keep ourselves busy rather than staying with the system that is and finding more and more ways to apply it to the self.
I don't know. Maybe you and I have a slightly different perspective on this, but I understand what you're saying. I think with me, I think there is, well, I'll just say this. In the timeline of somebody's growth, development, awareness, understanding of the world, what they're trying to accomplish fundamentally, I think there are moments in the timeline where, you could almost call it a hermit time period where you're just going inside and filleting out and diagnosing and adding all of the different elements you're seeing and adding layer upon layer upon layer of understanding, awareness, and complexity. And I think that there is something to be said for being at that moment in the timeline of just wanting to have a full, complete, rich understanding of something. But I think what ends up happening when somebody is on their journey is every level up of a journey always feels like the acme, right? Every level up always feels like you're at the top. And it's not until you take in the view and go, oh, wow, I figured all this stuff out, that you look around and realize, oh, no, there's more levels. I got to keep climbing. And I would say that this idea of this massively complex system and bringing in absolutely every layer. And by the way, I think a lot of type enthusiasts do what we're talking about. I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to be careful is almost every single person in the type community kind of does what we're talking about right now. I haven't seen very many influencers or, people who have been type professionals for a super long amount of time. There's a few of them that have kept things really simple, but a lot of them add these layers of complexity.
Wait, okay, I'm going to push back on this because we're coaching with Dr. John Beebe right now, who maybe that's who you're alluding to. He's a type professional. Well, he's not just a type professional. He's a Jungian analyst. He's a psychotherapist, or he's he's actually a clinical.
He's a psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist, that's right.
And Jungian psychotherapist.
Yeah, and so he took some of Jungian's archetypes, right? The different archetypes, and he matched those archetypes with the functions. I don't think that's creating an extra system on top of it. I think he's taking the fundamentals and he's finding new ways to approach it. He's not creating something new.
Well, I think actually, people who I really respect in this industry, people like Linda Behrens, Linda's added so many different beautiful layers of understing, like interactive styles.
Interaction styles. It's another way to approach the Myers-Briggs system.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are, our friend Dario Nardi, who's been on the podcast many times, he's done some work around understanding the cognitive functions as either analytic or holistic, which alters the function flavor and a preference for the function flavor. So there are different ways to slice and dice. And I don't, I mean, I'm not sure if that's not what you're talking about, Joel, but I do think there are a lot of, people who are on YouTube who, I've followed or I've watched their videos and I've observed what they're doing and how they're teaching. And there are some that go down a very complex diagnostic road, right? They're they're cross-checking all of these different models and maybe adding some new flavors to different models and that sort of thing. And I do think that is, I think there is something to be said for that style.
Fair enough.
Right? There is something to be said for the work that is done within because, sometimes sometimes you're adding all of those things because something in it is true. And that is going to be the thing that lives on because people have a tendency to attach to the true, if that makes sense. Like maybe you've added a whole bunch of stuff or cross-checked a million different styles and models, but there's one concept in it that is actually almost the justification for the entire complexity. And that one thing lives on after, right? And it's the through line. And I mean, is there a reason to, develop 999 light bulbs that don't work so that the thousandth one does? I mean, there is something to be said for that kind of work, I think. Personally, I understand it. Maybe it's because I'm an NT. Maybe it's because I'm TI.
I'm certain it's because you're an NT.
That said, I will concede what you just mentioned, which is, and I think I said this too, there is a law of diminishing returns. There is a moment when the complexity has become a bypass. Now, how other people are using it is their own. Everybody has a right to use all these tools however they want to.
Sure.
And I'm not going to judge how somebody uses a tool. I am, however, going to try to persuade people to use these tools in the way that I have observed is the healthiest and moves the needle the most. And so that's where my subjectivity comes in, which is I've seen a lot of different ways that people can use these models, and it seems consistent that when they use it in this way, they have the best results for themselves. And I have observed people in type communities use some of this information as a way to continue to basically study the model for its own sake, because it will give you rewards. If you're the kind of person who is fascinated by typologies and type systems, just learning more about them gives you a little bit of a little chemical cocktail hit of, ooh, I learned more of it, right? Oh, now I understand even more layers of this thing. And there is a point where the study of the system is no longer meant for application purposes, no longer meant to improve your life. It's just meant to learn more about it. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to understand that you're not going to get the rewards of application if you are not applying. You're not going to get the rewards of setting your life up better if you're not setting your life up better because you're trying to get to the end of the system, which is, there's no end to it. Robert Anton Wilson, I quote this all the time. You've probably heard me say it a million times in the practically 10 years we've been podcasting, that any good model is understandable at its base elements, but can be improved upon, right, and can be built upon for eternity. So if it's understandable at its base level, but also can be filleted out for eternity, what's the sweet spot? What's the sweet spot? And that will change for each individual person depending upon the moment of the timeline that they're at. If they are brand spanking new to this, then the usefulness at its base elements is going to be, that's going to be where they're at. And that's going to be the best place for them to have a you are here dot. If a person has been filleting this out already and they are way, way, way down the rabbit's hole of how many different ways of slicing and dicing and looking at it and adding to and taking away and all that stuff, if they're at a place where only that level of understanding can garner them any reward, like they're basically squeezing the last out of the blood from the rock, well, then that's where they're at. But as a person who has been studying this for a super long amount of time, and as a person whose life has changed by applying the information, my personal sweet spot is understand just enough of the complexity to be persuaded to make changes. Just understand enough about the system to be able to make the next growth and developmental choice, right? It's not a matter of constant and perpetual flaying out, because when I go down that road, suddenly I'm in a slipstream of information gathering and not doing the work I need to do, which requires distance and separation from the tools. When you do inner work, these tools are not the work. Learning the tool is not the work. The tool helps facilitate the work. The work still has to be done on an individual level. And that's what individuation is, right?
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. Because you had mentioned some teachers in this space, and I would hate for them to hear this later and assume that I'm trying to dump on them. So I just want to make sure my opinion is clear in the statement I'm about to make. I think what I appreciate about some of the people in the type space is anytime that they create more access or more application. So the understanding and access of something, like I think Linda Barron's interaction styles are great because it gives us access and application, but she doesn't negate or disrespect the system, Myers-Briggs system. She uses the same terminology. I mean, even us, when we use nicknames for the cognitive functions, we always reference the technical names that Carl Jung had. We don't just say that's what it's called now. We don't alter that. We always go back and keep the source material. Our car model, as an example, is built on the cognitive function stack, technically called a cognitive function stack. And we put it in the same order. We don't just mix up the order and make it what we want it to be just to fulfill our own desires. We don't negate what's come before. We don't disrespect what's come before. And I would say that these teachers are the same way. I'm not suggesting that people that add to the system in an access or application way are doing anything wrong. People that make more access and more application are very secure in the system itself. I think the biggest thing is, like you said at the very beginning of this podcast, people I think are getting confused. And they're thinking, well, this is just my subtype. I wish that they could get the benefits of type in the way that I've seen it benefit people through our coaching. That's what I wish for people. Again, you can do whatever you want. I'm not suggesting people have to do it this way.
I think people, the concept of when the student is ready, the teacher will come. I think that students and teachers meet each other where they're at. They're usually, a student that is going to follow a teacher that is encouraging them to see things through the lens of allowing them to continue reinforcing behaviors that are not healthy for them. If a student is going down that path, it's because the student is not ready to make the changes that they need to make. I mean, maybe
Fair
that's
enough.
a bit of a determinist perspective, but I think people, we're looking for people that are at our vibe. We're looking for people who are at approximately our vibrational energy. And so I think
Not just us, everybody is.
everybody, I think all humans are looking for people who are basically at their vibe. Or a lot of students are looking for teachers that might even be higher vibe than they are. And so that teacher is at a higher vibration. And so that's why they're attracted to the teacher, because that will help them level up in their vibration. And that's one of the reasons why I think personally, I mean, there are very, very few mentors, teachers, guides, masters, like whatever you want to call them, that have been my mentors the entire experience. Usually I follow them until I am able to get the same vibrational energetic level that they're at. And then now that person, now we're in a similar boat. Now there are some people who are constantly improving their vibration, right? There are some mentors that I've stuck with the entire time because they're always 2 steps ahead of me. They're always improving. But any teacher that's going to kind of hang at a certain vibrational level has to assume that their students are going to graduate past them. And so that's what ends up happening. So I almost kind of feel like all of these guides, everybody who is a teacher or a mentor out there, regardless of whatever they're teaching, exists to help people that are at a lower vibration level raise up to theirs. And then once they've done that, now they're ready for whatever comes next. And of course, there are some people who aren't learning for the purpose of raising their vibrational energy or doing personal growth or psycho-spiritual work. There's a bunch of people who aren't doing it for that reason. and they have to go someplace, right? So where they're going to go? They're going to go to people who just want to teach the system for its own sake. And since I don't really think in terms of save the world anymore, like that's a thought that I had a long time ago. Like, if we do this, we could save the world. If everybody knows this, we can save the world.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, what we're doing is we're just pumping out content and information and perspectives and opinions and energy that might help move the needle for a certain demographic of people.
Offering gifts.
Yeah. And if it moves the needle for a certain demographic of people, then it's accomplished what it was intended to accomplish. And if other people are pumping out different messages and different vibrational energy, then there's a place for them too, right? And I don't know sometimes I don't know what that place is, and I don't need to. And other times I see exactly what that place is, and I'm grateful that they occupy that space.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Same here.
Yeah. And so it's like, so I really hesitate to, I mean, maybe I'm wishy-washy. I don't like throwing shade. And also, it's hard for me to not see all the nodes in the system and understand what nodes those, like what is the purpose of that node in the system? Why must it exist? Why does it have to exist? How is it actually benefiting me, right? And benefiting them and the people that are following them? And I mean, we can literally be talking about anybody, because there's at this point, how many hundreds of YouTube channels are there teaching type, and how many hundreds of different systems are there and we're not even talking about, necessarily Myers-Briggs. I mean, there are Enneagram offshoot subtype, systems now that I have personal opinions on them, that I'm not big fans of them. And I don't think that that's necessarily that big of a deal, because obviously those systems are there for someone. Because if you talk shade about some of those systems, entire SWAT teams of loyal foaming at the mouth enthusiasts will come get you for talking shade about their system. So it's like, okay, well, obviously they're doing something for somebody, because otherwise those people wouldn't be coming, wouldn't be so upset that you talk negatively about this beloved system of theirs. So there's a place for all of these things to exist. Going all the way back to the original topic. Is that okay?
Let's do that. Let's do that.
This was quite the or extroverted intuition or exploration tangent, wasn't it?
Joel took us on this wild ride, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and there's a little bit of conviction in there for you too. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. And whereas my introverted thinking or accuracy is like, let me study this a little longer and come up with a conclusion. So to go all the way back, which is that there are certain schools of thought that when you have a relationship with your first and third function, dominant, tertiary, driver, 10-year-old, when you have a relationship where they go back and forth, we call that a loop, and we don't think it's a good thing. And there is a burgeoning idea in different type communities that it's just a subtype. It's just a variation on a theme. In the early part of this podcast, I like to think that I made a case for why it's not just a variation on a theme, that it's actually something that could be detrimental to your personal growth and development. And our observation, and we both gave our anecdotal experiences, Joel, that for us, going to the auxiliary second co-pilot function was a devastating game changer for us. Devastating game changer. Completely altered our lives forever, because we were what people would call first and third preferred, quote unquote, subtypes. I was an ENTP that absolutely preferred my extroverted feeling or harmony. You were an ENFP that absolutely preferred your extroverted thinking or effectiveness. We would be that subtype, and we realized that that was not healthy for us. When we did get into that second function, it was a game changer. Totally revolutionized our lives. And now we're advocates of that. Now we are like proselytizers for the power of that. When we started putting that into our coaching, we realized it wasn't just us. It's actually a pattern. This is a thing. And a big piece of that is, again, that it allows us to occupy the other attitude that is opposite from our preferred attitude. And by attitude, we mean introversion and extroversion. If you are an introvert, your preferred attitude is introversion, and your dominant or driver first function is going to be an introverted function, and it is going to want to stay in that world. It is going to want to stay inside. And that third tertiary 10-year-old function goes, oh, we get to stay inside. Like you can do the other thing. You can take in new information or make decisions, but you get to do it from all the way inside, and you don't have to get outer world feedback. There are some traps in that thinking. If you are an extrovert, Same deal. It's like the photonegative relationship. That third function goes, oh, you get to stay in an extroverted space. You never have to go inside. There's a problem with that, okay? And I would say that the two, I think before we went on our tangent of our opinions of the type community in general, which we don't usually talk about, so I don't know, maybe it's interesting, who knows? There's two different Jungian perspectives that I think are critical and crucial in understanding this dynamic. The first one is Jung's 4 archetypes of individuation, which we can briefly talk about, even though we're moving up on, I don't know, we're getting kind of late in this podcast, but I still want to mention them. And then John Beebe's model. Okay, so we've talked about Dr. John Beebe's 8-function model. And in his 8-function model, and I would recommend going back and listening to those podcasts, the first function, that dominant driver, is archetypally a hero. Okay, it's a hero function. And in John's model, the first and fourth function, which of course are polarities, we've talked about polarities or axes as well, that first and fourth function is a way to understand the self, right? It's our axis of self-relating. The second and third functions, co-pilot, 10-year-old, auxiliary, tertiary, those are an axis of relating to others. All right, so there are it's a way for us to have a relationship and understand other people.
These are the positions. These are not the functions being used.
Exactly.
In case you're confused, she's talking positionally.
That's right.
No matter what your function is in these positions.
Yeah.
She's talking about the axis of self is the first and fourth, so the driver and the 3-year-old, or the dominant and inferior. And then the co-pilot or auxiliary and the tertiary or 10-year-old is the axis of others.
Right, relating to other people. Just draw it out. If you're having trouble like sort of keeping this information in your head, just draw it out for yourself, create a car model or first or fourth functions, and just kind of bifurcate them between first and fourth and second and third, and just go, oh, okay, that's interesting. First and fourth is me understanding myself. And second and third is, oh, this is me relating to others and understanding myself in relationship to others. Okay, so that's crucial to understanding this next point, which is that the dominant driver, first function, is our hero archetype. Da-da-da, here we go. We're just going to save the world. We ride in on the white horse, and we're going to take care of all problems with our first function.
And then whatever cognitive function you have in that position colors how that hero shows up.
Right, exactly. For us, you and me, Joel, we both think that extroverted intuition or exploration is it's the solution to all life's problems, right? We're going to come in and pattern recognize and idea generate and flay out and think about opportunities. And we're going to do that ad nauseum as long as the outside world allows us to do that and doesn't shut us down and we're not seeing terrible, results from constantly and perpetually opening new loops, which of course happens, but that's our instinct. Our instinct is to go be a driver with that or a hero with that. The second auxiliary co-pilot function is the parent archetypal energy. So this is a more modest place to come from. It's like our understanding of how we give to the rest of the world, how we show up with service on our mind. When you think of parents, you can either think of people who are disciplining everybody else all the time, or you can think of constant and perpetual servants, which is actually what parenting is. I have a magnet on my fridge that says parenting is basically being screamed at by a tiny idiot all the time, and that's kind of what it is. It's like it is not a thankless job if your kids turn out well enough to go, oh, hey, well, that was a lot. Thank you so much for doing it. But up until that moment when they're like 40 and have their own kids, it's a thankless job, and it's a place of service. It's a place of wanting to enrich other people's experience. It's a place of like relating to others in the sense of doing a good job being a model. This is one of the reasons why that second function archetypally is so important. It shows up with a sense of modesty, a sense of responsibility to the outside world. It's a really beautiful archetypal energy that I think should not be overlooked. When you go to the third function, 10-year-old tertiary, the archetypal energy is called the pure eternus or puella eternus. It's Latin for eternal child, all right? So if we go first to third, we're edging out that whole idea of responsibility, of modeling, of modesty, of service orientation, of wanting what's in other people's best interest. And we stay in the archetypal loop of a hero that comes in overconfident, thinking it can solve all life's problems as a relation to self. And then as relation to others, relating to others, we show up as an eternal child. Okay, well, what is a 10-year-old always doing? A 10-year-old's always trying to get attention. They're always trying to get approval from other people.
Posturing.
They're always posturing, while at the same time having an uncertainty about how everything works and needing other people to help them. So when you stay in that first and third function, not only are you bypassing whichever world, attitudinal world, is the perspective you're missing, whether that's an extroverted function, so it's your feedback from the outside world and your ability to sort of understand a bigger context than just what's going on for you. Or if that second function is an introverted function, which requires you to introspect and be honest with yourself and what means something to you, right? And to go and relate to sort of your understanding of self to be able to understand the world. If you're bypassing all that responsibility, all that texture, all that understanding a bigger context and a bigger world, whether it's introverted or extroverted, and you're going to the third function, that means you're staying in a loop of, you're staying in the attitude you prefer already, so you're missing huge chunks of information, right? You're missing a perspective that's critical. And you're staying between an archetypal hero and an archetypal child. So it's basically the personality type of a fantasist. You are either a hero or you're like at the mercy of the world.
Or just the culture in general. I mean, how many superhero movies are on the Cineplex and on streaming? Like, we're obsessed with heroes, almost like adult children. Like, oh, look, my new Star Wars. I mean, I like this too. Star Wars, Marvel Universe. This seems to be the world we flow in entertainment often. This would make sense that this is starting to get brought all the way down to type. We want to be in a hero-child complex or dynamic because that's kind of how we're living our lives in a lot of ways.
Yeah. You've got a hero that is pretty sure it can fix everything it breaks, and you've got a 10-year-old that's breaking a bunch of stuff and throwing on like a blanket and calling it a cape. And this is archetypally not a healthy place to be. Not until you get into that second function of responsibility, parenting. What do I have to offer the world? It's no longer about me. Oh, I can't sleep in because my kid is sick and waking me up, right? Like, and I have responsibilities now. That's the archetype. That second function is the archetypal energy of somebody who's got to show up to work every day and got to do for the family and got to like teach and model and be responsible. So to me, missing that second function isn't just, of course, as I mentioned, and I keep saying it, an enormous amount of information from either the inner or the inner world or the outside world. But it's also missing the archetypal energy of giving, of responsibility, of showing up, right? Showing up for other people, not just for the self.
The word that comes to mind for me is maturity. It seems like there's a more mature place to come from as you round out your personality and grow that aspect of yourself.
Exactly.
And I would say I was very immature when I hadn't really accessed this part of me. I really, truly was well into my 30s. And I've gotten more mature over the years. I've settled down. I've been able to show up like literally more mature in my life as I've grown this part of me.
Exactly. It is so crucial and critical, in my opinion. So I think just looking at it through those archetype lenses, I think in my opinion, is a big argument against just seeing a first through third back and forth loop experience as being perfectly valid, right? It's valid in the sense that it exists and you can't do anything about it if somebody insists on being there, right? And everybody gets to decide how they want to experience themselves and they want to experience the world. Everybody gets that choice. It's valid in the sense of like they're allowed to make that choice and it's fine. And if you are a person who is interested in type for psycho-spiritual reasons, to become the best version of yourself, to grow and mature and have better results in your life, in a world where we have the phrase adulting as a verb for how complicated everything is and how kind of awful it is to be an adult and have to be responsible, and all these, I guess not terrible, but all these like pressures on us. Well, the way out is through, right? It's not avoidance. It's leaning in. It's surrender to these components of who we are. It's increasing our threshold for being able to deal with as how complicated life is and continues to get. Life is not getting any simpler, right? It is only getting more complicated with every generation because we've built a world that piles onto us a bunch of stuff that none of our ancestors had to deal with just through technologies. So the way out is not to give yourself a pass by staying in a hero and an internal child frame. It's to lean into the archetypal energy of parenting, of responsibility, of giving and service and purpose. Oftentimes, this is a place where we find what we're supposed to do because we get more of a sense of what we want to give. And then I would say the last Jungian perspective to see this through is the 4 archetypes of individuation. Right, all the chapters that surround chapter 10 in psychological types, right? All the other stuff Jung was talking about, which are the 4 archetypes of persona, ego, shadow, and let's say self with capital S. That's how John Beebe always talks about it when we do coaching with him. He's like S with a capital, or self with a capital S. The reason why having both your first and second dominant auxiliary driver co-pilot, both of those cognitive functions really well exercised and flexing, is that you, me, us, one, needs to have both an introverted and an extroverted relationship really dialed in order to understand self with a capital S, whole self. Because those 4 archetypal energies are going to pull on all of that. The persona, which I think in times past I mistook as a mask, right? As like something that's fake and you want to transcend it. I am now coming to understand how critical having a good persona actually is. And your persona is the extroverted part of who you are. It is the interface between yourself and the outside world. And your persona needs to be dialed in. It needs to be something that is a good representative of you. It needs to be something that is not indicating some other form of bypass, some other form of attitude. It needs to not have its backbone and go, well, screw you, I get to do whatever I want, and I'm not going to play your game. And it needs to not hand itself over completely and go, everybody else tell me what you want me to be. It's got to be a good tension point of representing the self well, while at the same time interfacing with the outside world in the healthiest way possible. This requires good introverted, introspective knowledge of oneself and a healthy extroverted interfacing experience. It requires a person to have both the introverted and the extroverted attitudes dialed in well. And if there's a schism between these, if it's weighted way too far one side or the other, you're not going to create that healthy tension. Your persona is not going to have it's not going to be healthy.
Dr. Beebe gives a great example of a client who came to his office once who was fairly disheveled, hadn't taken a shower, and wasn't wearing clothes that fit very well, and wanted to do some psychoanalysis with him. And he said, "This is my true self. This is how I feel like I should show up to the world." And Dr. Beebe said, "Well, we need to work on your persona because you don't really interface with the rest of the world very well. You haven't showered. You're disheveled. Before we do any work in depth, let's just figure out your image, your persona itself, because that has to interface with the world well. It needs to be in good harmony, good balance." And I think that's a great example of this on the other side. It's like, I'm sure that person showed up to his office assuming like, I don't have persona. I've dropped my mask. I'm the real deal. I'm just who I am showing up to the world. And I think there's a case to be made for persona both directions. I think often we experience persona as somebody that's shining it on too much. They're pinning on a smile. They're never saying anything's wrong with them. They're just happy all the time, or at least they feel like they've got it all together all the time. And we're like, we need to see more authenticity from you. But it can also happen on the other side too.
Yeah, John calls it the most neglected of the Jungian archetypes, and for good reason, because he mentioned that the psyche is always trying to get the persona right. And what we neglect in the conscious, persona is very much about our conscious, right? It's the place that we are some of the most aware of who we are because we're watching ourselves engage and interact with the outside world. It's like the behaviorist part of us. When we get our persona wrong, it overburdens the entire psyche. And John's argument is that eventually it will damage the psyche if our persona is not right, right in quotes. What is a right persona? Well, only you get to decide that as an individual, but you have to be paying attention to it. And you understand that through individuation and an understanding of self and interfacing. This requires a tension point, a very healthy tension point of both the introverted and the extroverted parts of who we are. And that auxiliary, second, co-pilot function is our strongest access point to that other attitude, to the other side of the aisle. It is the place that we go with the highest amount of certainty in the world that we're the least comfortable, right? It gives us a leg up. It gives us an advantage. We have certainty in that function in a world that is less comfortable. And you want to do that. You want to give yourself all those advantages. So that second function is it's such a help. It's such a help. Way more so than something that should be pushed aside, neglected, or only used in the way that I want to use it. That's the other thing I see. When somebody has a looping experience, it doesn't mean they never go to their second function. It just means that they're picky about when they're going to go to their second function. It's like being picky about food, right? I only want to eat what I want to eat. Well, great. And now your body is going to show it. Because when we only eat what tastes good, we are usually missing a ton of nutrients, crucial, critical, important nutrients that don't always get put in the most tasty vehicle. So that second function, if a person identifies and uses a first to third or dominant, tertiary, driver, 10-year-old, constant sort of back and forth pinging off of each other dynamic, if they use that as a personality subtype, then they're probably being very picky about when they're going to go to that second function. And it means they're leaving money on the table. They're missing a bunch of nutrients that are required for really good health, like psychological health. So that's the persona. Okay, that's and my yet another pitch about why that auxiliary function is so important. The second component is the ego, right? And the persona is the most conscious part of who we are, but the ego is another conscious aspect. And when we define ourselves through limitations, we define ourselves by only being like really extroverted or really introverted, then there are components of our ego that are available to us, but we've actually shoved them into the shadow. We don't look at them. They're right there. They're available for us to see. In fact, they're begging for us to look at them, but we're not looking at them because our preference, our comfort zone is over in this other attitude. So there are components of our ego that are wildly available for conscious awareness that we're unnecessarily putting in a shadow, right? And the shadow could be, called basically anything we're unconscious about. So there's a lack of ego awareness when we don't look at that attitude that's less comfortable for us. That means our shadow grows. A big part of individuation is making the unconscious conscious, is shrinking the size of the shadow, of not shoving things over there that don't need to be shoved over there because they're totally neutral. We already have a shadow filled with things that we don't want to see about ourselves because they're the bad news. Why would we put things that are neutral over there and increase the size of the shadow, thus keeping us from a better sense of self with a capital S? Because self with a capital S is taking in the entire territory. It's their persona. It's the ego. It's as much of the shadow as we can possibly access in order to understand what lives outside of those components as well and anything in the cracks so that we can individuate into whole self. And when we put things into the shadow unnecessarily, we're actually creating more of a schism between ourselves and our whole self. We're, again, leaving money on the table for no reason. So once again, I would argue from the position of a psycho-spiritual lens. Now, I mean, you could argue that Jung's work was only psychological. I would say that you probably haven't read many works of Jung if you think it's entirely psychological and not also very spiritual. But that said, even if you want to just keep it in the psychological realm and not see it through the lens of spirituality, I would still argue that the work of that second function, the access point of getting into that other attitude in the most comfortable way possible and then exploring the hell out of it, I think it's hard for me to see an argument for the other side. Like I feel like I must be missing something because to me, the rewards are so obvious of getting into that second function that if I were to over-identify with my third function at the cost of my second function, I feel like I can't see anything other than a spiritual and psychological bypass.
If you want to feel good about yourself right now, understand how you're wired right now, and continue to feel okay as you are, I think that's the argument. I think it's nothing wrong with that. If a lot of people are like, hey, I just accept myself, who I am, like everything that exactly as is in my life. And I think there's an acceptance maybe that's the argument, is just accept how you are as of this moment. And if you're happy with that and the results you're having in your life, then there's no reason to grow the other part.
Yeah. No, I think that you're right. That is a really good argument. And I think it's a good one too. It's not just like I'm
not being dismissive.
No.
I'm being genuine when I say that. I think that's a place people can be. And sometimes that's where people need to be for a time or maybe the rest of their lives.
I totally agree with that. And to give oneself permission to be oneself and have acceptance at the starting point, I think is really important. In the lens of personal growth and development, you don't demonize your starting point not because there's nothing wrong with it, but because you will end up obsessing over the demonization of your starting point. So it's not effective. It lacks effectiveness to go, oh, I'm a terrible, terrible person, and beat yourself up. To go, okay, this is where I'm at. This is how I'm wired. These are my experiences in life. This is my starting point. I'm going to accept that and not give myself unnecessary judgment. Frees you. It frees your psychological real estate to be able to now do improvements. So if you're coming at type through the lens of personal growth, then you do want to accept yourself. And that's something I had to do, right? As an ENTP that discovered in the early days that I was over-relying on my 10-year-old or tertiary of extroverted feeling or harmony, I had to accept that that's what I was doing. I also could make a case for why that helped me survive the context I was raised in. I understood why that served me for a time. I also realized that if I was going to keep doing that, or if I chose to not get into my auxiliary or co-pilot, then I was going to keep having the same struggles, the same problems, not learn the right lessons. So I had to accept where I was, where I had come from, and that there was more work to do. And I think that that's probably the biggest argument I would make is if you are accepting that you have this relationship with your first and third function, and it is a lot, right? It's overwhelming your life choices. You're making choices based on this thing. You are limiting your information to just coming through this channel or whatever it looks like for you. I would argue that accepting that is critical in order to graduate beyond it. And if a person goes, no, that's just how I'm wired, that's just who I am. Again, I validate people's choices in the sense that you're allowed to do whatever you want to, and you're allowed to have whatever life experience you want to. And if you're looking at it through the lens of psychospiritual work, then I would say through that lens specifically, it is an inaccurate frame. It is a frame that will not serve you. It will unnecessarily limit you. And I do think through that framework, through the paradigm of seeing this as growth and development work, it is not a valid subtype. It is a loop.
So we've talked about loops before. We have multiple podcast recordings from the past. All of our podcasts are evergreen, meaning that they're not dated to a time or place. We don't talk about current events. And so if this is your first episode or you've been a newer listener, maybe just in the last few months or so, you can go back to our entire archive of podcasts and listen, and they're just as relevant today, I think, as they were when we recorded them. And so we've got some recordings on these things. You can search on our website and find an episode out of, we've done hundreds of episodes at this point over over 8 years, right?
Yeah, well, I think if you go to the website and you put in loops into the search engine, you'll see all of the podcasts that we've done that have talked about how each personality type specifically experiences the loop.
Yeah. So, wow, that was a long podcast today. We got some good stuff out, I think, though.
Well, I think we went on a tangent we were expecting to go, which is sort of our theory on the type community in general. So I don't know how useful that is, but it is. I mean, I guess we do this for us too, right? Not just for the listener. We're like, hey, what is my opinion on all this stuff?
Yeah.
So anyway, have at.
Well, and I would love to hear what your opinion is. You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone. You've been the third person in this conversation. And now it's time to hear what's coming up for you. I'm sure as we were talking, certain opinions, thoughts, convictions maybe, insights were coming up, and we'd love for you to come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, go ahead and leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. You might have a story of growing your co-pilot auxiliary function or staying in what we would call a loop, and you're going to make a case for, no, I'm the healthiest version of my type that's ever existed, and you'll explain why, and I will be enlightened and understand more, which I'm genuine saying that. That sounds dismissive, but I'm genuinely saying that. I will be enlightened to maybe some people's use of type that I haven't considered.
Yeah, come rock our world. Yeah. Come tell us why that first and third position and staying there is actually giving you everything you wanted.
Just please make sure you're being intellectually honest, because and clear in your communication. Because sometimes people say something like, "What are you even talking about? That doesn't make any sense."
Yeah.
So please be intellectually honest, but we'd love to hear from you. So you can do that over at personalityhacker.com.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot, and I read every one, so please go do so. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers, and if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. We are in the midst. We are elbows deep in creating new, what we're calling owner's manuals for each personality type. They go through the type in terms of cognitive functions, what your flow state is, your loops, your grips that we hinted at, and ways to really optimize your relationship to your cognitive functions and your personality type to get the most out of them, to do psychospiritual work, as we talked about in this podcast. We are in the middle of creating them. We are almost done. We hope to have them done. Well, I mean, I'm not going to date this podcast too much, but within some weeks. And when you're listening to them, they may already be done. So if you're listening to it in real time, those are coming out. They're very exciting. And we are looking forward to presenting them to you, these new personality type owner's manuals. And if you're listening to this in the future, go check them out because they are on the website, I bet, right now. personalityhacker.com. Look at our suite of programs and go grab one because you are a person who's invested in psychospiritual work. I think if you hung with us this long, I think that's what you're interested in. So go get yourself a copy.
Well, I mean, psychospiritual work sounds so advanced. I mean, these also help you with basic things like relating to your spouse or your friends or even yourself in a day-to-day aspect as well. It's not just psychospiritual.
Yes. Well, what I mean by that is become the best version of yourself and relate to others in a healthier way. Okay.
You didn't even read that. That was really good. That's like a tagline.
Yeah. I'll never remember what I said ever again.
Well, we can roll back the recording and just transcribe it, I guess.
That sounds good.
All right, we better end this. This is really long.
Shush.
My name is Joel Markwit.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we're going to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.